Hello, writers, and welcome to the Author Burnout Coach, the show where we put the publishing industry and all sorts of societal messaging under a microscope. I'm your host, Isabel Sterling, YA author and certified life coach. In each episode, I offer you specific steps that you can take to break up with burnout and reclaim your love of stories. I'm on a mission to dismantle the bookish hustle culture, one writer at a time. I hope you'll join me. Hey writers, welcome to episode 21. I interviewed two fantastic authors to kick off Pride Month, and the conversation was so amazing. I decided to split it into 2 episodes rather than cut any of the incredible insights. But make sure you listen all the way to the end of the episode for details about the Write, Publish, Profit Superstack that includes access to my Create Better Characters with Coaching program. But first, here is part 1 of my amazing conversation with YA authors Lynn Herman and Mara Fitzgerald. I am so excited to bring you this episode today with Mara and Christine. So I'm going to let you both actually introduce yourselves and your books, but I have a little bit of a twist. I would love it if you would brag on yourselves a little bit when you do your intro. So tell the listeners what cool things you achieved. I see you dying. Just tell us about the cool things in your career. You all have brag-worthy things. I Googled it to make sure, and you definitely do. So tell us the things.
Oh, God. I'm going to go before Christine because Christine is objectively more accomplished than me. So I am Mara Fitzgerald. I am the author of the young adult book Beyond the Ruby Veil, which is a young adult fantasy about the worst girl you will ever meet, trying to save her city and becoming the villain instead. And I also had a sequel, which came out during the pandemic. So now I have to brag on myself. And I don't know what to say. I'm panicking a little bit. So I think my big accomplishment is that I wrote a sequel during the pandemic and people seem to enjoy it, which was a huge accomplishment. And also I had a reader make a really cool TikTok about my book where she wore costumes for all the different characters. That was a career highlight.
So fun.
That is so cool.
If you have that, you need to send it to me so I can link it in the show notes.
Also, Beyond the Ruby Veil got a starred review, Mara. If you're not going to brag about that, I'll brag about that for you.
Starred review.
Oh, yeah, I guess it did.
And I also know I was going back through and you sold at auction, which may not seem brag-worthy to you now, but like I'm thinking like the new writers who are listening to this were like, if only I ever go to auction, then my life will be perfect. That's sort of what I want to dispel a little bit with this episode today.
Oh boy. Yes.
Yeah,
so I did sell at auction. So yes, that is my other brag.
Yeah, that's fun. All right, Christine, tell us all the things.
Okay. Oh my God, you should have seen the look on my face when Isabel was like, you should brag. It was comical. Hello, I am Lynn Herman. I am the author of The Devouring Grey duology, The Drowning Summer, and the All of Us Films duology, and also other stuff that I can't talk about yet. Probably most notably, I co-wrote the All of Us Films duology with my best friend, Amanda Foodie, and it hit the New York Times list and the indie list, and other fun stuff happened to it. And if you make me brag about it much more, I will combust into flames, and you'll have to do the podcast with Mara by herself.
No, that's good. And I love making authors brag because one, we're really bad at it.
Yes.
And also because we spend so much time as new writers dreaming about the future when we're going to like get an agent and sell at auction and be a New York Times bestseller and all of these different things. And then when we get there and they happen, we sort of forget that they were cool things that we wanted to happen. It's just like we have amnesia kind of like, I don't know. Writing books is still hard. So we sort of forget that we did achieve cool things. I actually want to start right there. So while achieving these cool things is definitely cool and exciting in the moment, I'm sure, Mara, when you were like getting all the different offers, you were like, oh my God, it's happening. But then it doesn't magically prevent burnout. It doesn't mean your career is perfect. Life still continues. So I'd love to hear a little bit from each of you, your experience with burnout, maybe before and after some of these milestones and how it changed, if at all.
I actually think that I have an inverse reaction to getting good news when something exciting happens, even if it's something that I like dreamed about happening for a really long time. Actually, especially if it's that, it immediately like freezes me up. I'm like, oh no, I can't do anything else. I've peaked and that's it, and there's nothing else
Mm.
to do. And it's like the complete opposite of a creative surge. It feels like I freeze up, and then I feel guilty for being upset and panicking, and then I feel guilty about that, and it kind of all compounds. It's so hard for me to talk about my achievements because even though I'm really proud of them, I also tend to associate them with actually periods of extreme creative drought as
Mm.
my brain short circuits and tries to figure out what to do. I think I'm extremely motivated, or I was anyway. I've done a lot of work on this, on by like fear of failure, and also by I love writing books, but I don't really want to be perceived. And the world informing me that it does perceive me is actually horrifying to me. And I'm like, please stop. It would be great if you could perceive my books and instead of my name, there was just like a doodle of a slug or something.
I'm curious, did you know that about yourself sort of going into this, or were you pre-agent really excited about those milestones and found out as they happened that it was kind of freezing for you?
Yeah, no, I had no idea. I wish I'd known. It would have made me less embarrassing. And I also probably would have written under a pen name and probably just done more work to distance myself from author persona self so that I could like I think more healthily deal with that.
I do think I mean, it's certainly not an everybody thing, but is actually pretty common to when you have success or you are in a place where you're more visible than you've ever been, like that freeze response is actually fairly common, especially for folks socialized as women, because we've through the generations being visible was very dangerous. So it's pretty
I
common
definitely think
actually.
there's some truth to that. I've heard other people say similar things. I felt like an asshole the first time I tried to be like, I don't think I'm having an appropriate reaction. Turns out no one's ever having an appropriate reaction to anything.
Right. Because what's appropriate? Who decides what that is? Certainly not
Yeah.
us. All right, Mara, what about you? What was your sort of experience with sort of hitting some of these milestones and if that had any effect, positive or negative, on your experience with burnout?
So the first thing I'll say is just to preface this, as you all can see that I did have to be reminded about things that happened in like 2020. I
Mm.
don't know, it's the combination pandemic publishing has sort of erased my memory. And yeah, I think like you said, Isabel, this is like a very common thing that happens is that as soon as we achieve something, we forget that it was something we wanted. And we're just like, anyways, that's something that happened. Now I'm worried about another thing. So I
Mm.
definitely have a
Yes.
really big case of that. I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't even remember anything that happened. So with that in mind, I will say, because I know that you have like unagented writers listening to this, that my journey to publication was quite long. I queried 3 or 4 books before I got an agent. And then my first book that I put on submission didn't sell. So I had to write another book. And then I changed agents. And that book eventually was like the one that sold. So all of that happened, but I'll focus on my most recent period of burnout because that's the one that my memory still functions and allows me to remember actually occurred, which was definitely after the release of my first book. And I think this is very common because we talk about hyping up these big achievements. Like the book actually coming out feels like the ultimate, like, once this actually comes out, then I'm going to be like a real author and I'm going to be like made it and I'm not going to have all this anxiety anymore. Jokes. It's actually like for me, it was a large period of anxiety leading up to the release. And then after the release, it was a long period of depression because
Mhm.
it's all of that excitement. And then the book comes out and then it's out in the world. And that's actually when your book's life begins, but it doesn't feel that way to authors. It feels like we've been living for release day. And then once release day is over, we're like, what do I do next? So that was really
Yeah.
difficult for me, especially after I finished my series and I had to think about what to write next because I found it impossible to write without publishing being in my head. Once you have
Mm.
had something read by publishing, then I start to write a new thing and I think I can't put that trope in it because readers won't like that trope and I'll get 1 star on Goodreads and someone will make a TikTok about how they don't like this trope. And like none of that is conducive to creativity, but it's so hard to get it out of your head. And you also just feel like whatever happened with your first book, I think whether your first book sort of did objectively well or it did objectively not well, there's double-edged swords to both of it. Because if it did well, then
Mhm.
you have that feeling of like, I'll never be able to recreate that. That was the best I could do. Oh my God, like it's all downhill from here. And if it didn't do well, you feel like, well, no one wants my books. No one's ever going to want to read anything I write. Why am I even bothering? Like, it's just it's either way, like as authors, we have a way of thinking like, oh, it's all downhill from here. So that was definitely what happened to me. I was like, there's no way. Like, that was it. That was the end. It's all downhill now.
Well, and I think it becomes such a lonely kind of process, especially if you don't have writer friends who are sort of going through it around the same time, because you spend so long dreaming of this moment, thinking that once I get there, then it's going to be so much better. And then you get there and it's the same or worse. You're like, well, I can't complain about it because there's all these people who want to be where I am. And yet it's not this magical world of butterflies and rainbows and everything's perfect all the time, even though we've convinced ourselves that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's objectively like very good things that have happened to you. Like and I think this is why it's important to have writer friends and also non-writer friends, because you need writer friends because they understand what you're going through. Mm-hmm. And you need non-writer friends who can be like, but my book isn't in this Barnes and Noble or like whatever, like some like little thing. And they're like, oh my God, like you wrote a book and your book is like published. That is a huge accomplishment. Like just calm down. Like basically they're like, it's not that big a deal.
Once I was having, when I was at debut, I was having a debut meltdown, which is a thing that I did a lot, which is, I think, fairly common. I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but it was definitely a common occurrence for me. And my partner was like, okay, you know what? You wrote a book. How many people do you know who've done that? And I just started crying and I went, a lot.
Yeah, because if you think about it, we're all overachievers. Like you're surrounded by other people who are also extremely motivated. So you're like, everyone writes a book. Like this is so easy. Like clearly everyone I know has done it. No, you just know a lot of high achieving people.
Right.
We forget what a big deal it is to even finish the first draft of a manuscript in the first place. I also really like what you said about like hearing publishing in your head once you try to write something new after you sell a book. And I think like part of why that happens might be because when you're on like the journey to publication, trying to get an agent and trying to sell, you teach yourself to try and write what publishing wants. And then once you've twisted yourself into that particular pretzel, you're like, oh, well, okay, now I have to do that forever and ever. Like my voice isn't the most important one to listen to. But you can't listen to the voice of Goodreads or even, you know, your agent or your editor. You have to learn how to pull your own voice out of it again.
Yeah, it feels like the first time you get a book deal or even the first time you get an agent, like the first time you get that outside publishing professional who's like, I validate your work. Like in your head, that's what's happening. If they're like, I want to represent this or I want to buy this, that's validation. And so you're like, what did I do to get that? I have to recreate, like I did the magic formula and like I have to keep doing that. And it's like, actually probably what you did was wrote something that connected with you and therefore it connected with someone else. But we get it in our head, like I can hack publishing. I can hack my way back in.
Yeah. And we sort of twist into this pretzel of like, it has to be close enough, but it can't be the same and it can't be too different, but it's like sort of like you're trying to find this path forward. But yeah, I know. And I'm curious if this is the same for both of you too. Because I've heard this from a lot of writers is, especially if you've gone through a number of manuscripts before you get an agent, the one that tends to, from what I've seen, like either get the agent or sell is the one where you're just sort of like, screw publishing, screw everything I know. I'm going to write what I want to write. And that tends to be the one that finally connects.
Yeah, that absolutely happened to me. And I had my book that went on submission that did not sell. Friends who have read it were like, their feedback on it was like, they're like, it's not bad. It was just very, like, it was a nice little fantasy book. Like, they're like, that was cute. Like, okay. And then the book I had that sold is like the most unhinged thing that came out of my brain.
It's so good though. I had so much fun reading it.
Oh, it's a great time. It is unhinged, but I have so much respect for it.
But like to get to that space, and the reason I got to that space was because I had literally just had something fail on submission. And it's like, well, that didn't work. So you know what? I tried to write something I thought was marketable. I'm just going to do what I want now and then write the weirdest thing I could think of. I think that is the secret as far as I'm concerned.
What happened to me is a little different, I think. My debut novel, The Devouring Grey, was the 5th book I had ever written, but it was the only book I had ever queried. I wrote it and I revised it and I queried it and it didn't go anywhere. And then I entered it into this contest called Pitch Wars and it was chosen to be mentored by a published author. And then I revised it for a couple of months and then a bunch of agents got to look at it in a special showcase and request it. And that's still not how I got an agent. It was from a Twitter pitch contest. But I actually think I wrote weirder and more out there ideas before I wrote The Devouring Gray, and I kind of reined myself in with that one. I felt like I needed to hone in on the stuff that people were responding well to, but I could tell that people were the most consistent feedback I would get from like critique partners would be like, I'm confused by this. I tend to like create incredibly convoluted and layered world building systems, and there's always too many characters. I also really love writing multi-POV books. It just gets like too big, too fast. There was a certain level of what I was doing that was working, but my brain wanted to go beyond it and I needed to like pull it back, which actually I think made it even harder when you're like, oh, this is the only thing people are only ever going to care about if you do that. I convinced myself that that was what I wanted to do, but I kind of wanted to be weirder. I didn't feel that way. But what's funny is that when I did kind of decide that I didn't really care and I would just have fun and write something that was like campy and was completely self-indulgent and ridiculous, I think people responded better to it. So I think it just happened a little later in my career, but that is definitely true. Like when Amanda and I were writing villains, I was like, I don't think anyone's going to want to buy this book. This book is ridiculous.
I'm convinced that's the secret. If at some point you're like, this is the silliest book ever and no one is going to buy it, but I think it's hilarious and I love it.
It was just like, great. Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. We'll write a death tournament book in this era. Okay. We're going to make the magic system ridiculous. We're going to make all of the POV characters terrible people. We're going to just fill it with like all kinds of ridiculous, basically just inside friendship jokes. Nobody's going to care.
Paradoxically, if you're just like, whatever, we're going for it, then people care. Like people respond to that, I think.
People can tell when a creative has like put their whole soul into something, I think. Like if you have a really strong emotional response to your own work, readers will often also have a strong emotional response to it. You can't control if it's positive or negative.
Right.
Respond to it.
I was just putting together a piece of my program for my clients about like dealing with feedback. And I pulled a 1-star review and a 5-star review of my recent book and be like, which book is better? They're the exact same book. They had completely opposite reactions to it. And that has to be fine because you can't control it. It just is what it is.
They had completely opposite reactions, but they had reactions.
Yes, they did.
They felt something.
Yeah, one was even like, I think it was a DNF. It was like, I got 17% in it and I just hated it. It was so predictable. And the other one was like, it's so unique and innovative. It's like, yeah, it's all in the eye of the beholder. I would love to know a little bit about like your range of like writing process when you're in a good place and it's really sustainable and you're making good progress, but it's not like you're going to push yourself into burnout.
For me, it changes literally by the week. I don't know if that's normal, but I think it may have been Susan Dennard who referred to it as getting in the water. If you're in the water with a book, you're sort of immersed. And then if you get out, it's very similar to once you get into a pool, especially if like the pool is cold. Sometimes it's like not very fun to get in, but once you're in, you're in. And then if you get out, it's like a whole thing to get back in. So that's definitely what happens to me. And it's very difficult because sometimes you like want to be in the water, but publishing has a way of pulling you out. That's what I found really difficult about like writing my first book under contract, was because I needed to be in that like unhinged creative space that we were talking about. And like I could get in there for like a day and then I would get some email from publishing that was like completely threw me out. So a lot of my process has been about how to figure out how to cultivate that space for myself and like really protect that mental space, because I think writing is such a mental game. You really, it's like all mental. You really just have to protect and cultivate that creative space for yourself. And at the same time, you also have to know when you need to take a break. So that's a thing, like, right, people call that fallow periods. Like if a field is fertile or the field needs to have a fallow period in order to like prepare to be fertile again. So that's another thing that's really difficult for me. Yeah, I don't have any answers. I just sympathize with everyone who's like, am I like super burnt out? Do I just need like to push myself a little bit and I'll be able to get back into it? Or do I like legitimately need a break? Like it's really hard to know when to push yourself and when to take a break.
Well, and I think part of the reason it's so challenging is that especially we're just not taught to trust ourselves and trust our own bodies and know what we need. So we're constantly questioning am I burnt out or do I just need a nap? Or am I just trying to avoid doing this because it expends energy and the brain doesn't like to expend energy? And if I just start, it'll be okay. And we're not given the tools to sort of differentiate between those things and just try and see. What about you, Christine?
I think for me, it's about recognizing what is and isn't work. Writing is actually, to become a professional author, is actually to do about 100 jobs. Writing is, I would say, one of the easier ones for me, but there's so much other stuff you have to do. Some of it you have to do, some of it you feel like you have to do. I at least often feel like it's like you have to be kind of an advocate for yourself in so many ways. You have to be able to like market your work effectively, and like you have to be able to sell yourself at first when you're querying and pitching to an agent. Then you have to believe that your worth matters when you land at a publisher, where most of the time, you know, you're going to have to speak up if you want something. And of course, there's the whole minefield of trying to promote your work on social media. And all of that stuff takes up a ton of effort and energy and brain power. But for a while, I didn't really think of it as like work. I just thought of it as like stuff I had to do. But I still was like, but writing is your job. It's all your job. So I decided to try instead to like rethink the way that I was approaching all of it. And I write full time. So I would be like, okay, this is the part of my workday where the only thing I'm going to do is write. No email, no phone, no anything else. Put it all away. The only job is the screen. And that actually really helped me a lot, because I didn't feel that like crushing pressure to go do something else and try and figure something out. I was like, there's probably nothing happening where if you haven't said something in an hour, it won't matter. I know like everyone has kind of like different schedules and stuff that work for them. I try to treat writing as roughly a 9 to 5 because my partner has a more traditional like office job, although he hasn't really been in the office in 2 years, but still. And so I try to kind of keep to his hours so that we can have like a sort of at least ostensibly normal work-life balance, where it's like I do my work during the work hours and then I go eat dinner and like hang out with my partner and sometimes like see friends or play D&D or like watch TV or pet my cat or whatever at night. That being said, all of that goes out the window when I'm on deadline. My biggest issue is that if you tell me that I need to do something in like X time or X days, it'll become like my whole identity. I will just completely ignore all of my basic human needs in order to get work done, especially when you're writing and when you're working on multiple projects at a time, you're trying to juggle a bunch of different aspects of the writing career. So like maybe promo stuff alongside drafting or whatever. It can just get really, really crushing. I've caught myself at various points over the last 2 years. I've been working 6-day weeks, 12 to 13-hour days. It's been a lot. And sometimes I do think that kind of crunch is unavoidable when you get put on a tight schedule for something. But often I think there's maybe for example, I didn't want to explain to my agent how bad it was and how much I maybe needed a break or a minute. I will tend to only tell her about how stressful things have been for me after they're over, which is incredibly unhelpful. Don't do that. Don't be scared to ask for help. Don't be scared to admit to yourself that you might need a break. Pushing and pushing and pushing means that you'll probably just burn yourself out harder and for longer, and you might develop some weird complexes that might take lots of therapy to get rid of.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I would say is that obviously I was a writer for a really long time before I was a published author. And I think it's important to treat writing like a job well before anyone ever pays you for it. And by treat it like a job, I mean, find a way to make it part of what you do without becoming your whole identity. It's so easy for that. For me anyway, it was writing was my escape when I was a kid. It was the one thing that I always felt like I was good at and that made me happy. And then when it became my job and it felt like there was all this other stuff attached to it, it was actually really crushing to lose it as effectively a support system. It didn't feel like there was anything else in its place. And so having to find effectively another hobby was actually really important, and helped me avoid crashing and burning, at least, for now.
Yeah. Well, and I think I heard this actually recently from one of my clients of treating writing like a job, but that doesn't mean, jobs have vacation days and jobs have sick days. It doesn't mean you have to write 24/7, 365 to count as good enough. And I think
that's the other thing I think is so important about treat writing like a job, because you're oh wait, if I was doing this, if I was sitting in a corporate office and doing this, I would never work these hours. I would never put it.
Would never work under these conditions. Yeah, that's you said a couple of things, Christine, that like reminded me. I had a very similar experience. I remember like after my debut came out, like one of the worst parts of the post-debut depression was that I felt like publishing had ruined bookstores for me. And it was crushing. I was like, I can't go into a bookstore anymore because I think about how my book isn't on the shelf. And I think about how I'm like a failure. And I was like, this is horrifying. Like, this is a horrifying thing that publishing has done. But it kind of feels like you have to like take writing back, and it kind of feels like publishing will try to take writing away from you. And most of the time we're writers because even that we need to figure out how to make it not our whole identity, but we probably do use writing as kind of like an escape, like a support system, but at the very least a way of processing things. I know that's how I use my writing. I'm always like processing something. And when publishing takes that away from you, you're like, oh my God, like, what do I do now? Yeah, it was horrifying.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I actually also went through a period of time where I couldn't go in any bookstore.
Okay, so this is just common. This is great.
I'm so sorry that it also happened to you, but it makes me feel a little better about it because I was like, I don't know how to explain to people. People would be like, oh my gosh, let's go. I think it was because like my friends, like very, very well-meaning and loving, would be like, oh my gosh, let's go see if they have your book every time we were like near a bookstore. And I would be like, this is my hell. I don't want this. I'm proud of the work I did, but like, I don't want it to turn into this kind of like, oh, well, now every bookstore is like a weird chance to reevaluate myself and to be like, well, am I good enough? If my book is on the shelf, then that means I'm good enough. And like whether a bookstore stocks your book or not has absolutely is no bearing on like your career or your value as a person. But like turning it into a weird scavenger hunt like that made me never want to go inside a bookstore again.
Yeah, it's rough. It really was like, I didn't even want to talk about publishing. Honestly, I still don't like talking about publishing. And my first book came out in October 2020. And I'm still like, I like warn people, I'm like, we can talk about publishing, but like, I may not be happy at the end of it. Like, this is not going to be a fun conversation for me. Just so you know, I'm not going to be like, chill. I may actually not realize it and go home and be like, well, now I feel horrible. I wonder why. I guess there's no way of knowing. It's definitely not because I talked about publishing.
It's a mystery. Yeah. So actually that brings up a good point. Like there's so much shit that publishing throws at you. Like, and if you, I heard once, and I talked about it recently on the podcast. I think Victoria Schwab said it. If you stay in publishing long enough, all the good stuff happens and all of the bad stuff. Like you're going to get a series canceled. You're going to have books that don't sell well. You're going to have like all the shitty stuff is eventually going to happen. So I'm curious if either of you are something you're still working with, or if you have thoughts on how do you then separate out whatever publishing is doing, like whatever their nonsense is, from your enjoyment of what you created. Like, I know for me, my most recent book, I think it is the best book that I've written. It's amazing. And both my agent and my editor were on maternity leave, and it feels like it just launched into the world and nobody knows about it. And it sells like way less per week than the books that are like 3 years old still, like to this day. So it's like, for me, I kind of like give that to publishing. I'm like, well, that is your problem. Like you didn't promote it. Like you didn't, that's a you problem. I can still love the story. And I've gotten pretty good at separating those things, of just being like, that's on you. I'm not going to take that on as for myself, because like I did everything that was my responsibility. Also, while like being a new mom and doing all of that stuff too. So I'm curious how if you are able to, or how you're starting to maybe untangle those two things.
That's so funny, Isabel, because I had the same, like, I did a lot of angry journaling after my debut came out, just like processing my feelings. And one of the things definitely a theme I repeated was like, you will not put this on me. I was like, no, like I will not take this on, because I think it's really easy to. And at first I did. And then at some point you're like, why am I taking this on? I am one person. And I'm being blamed because like this mega bajillion dollar company didn't promote a book. Like, how is that my fault? Like it's really easy to take it on. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But our name is the one on the book. And so it's so hard for us to separate ourselves from it. And I think particularly with debuts, I mean, I hope this is true. So you all can tell me if it's true or not. When is your first book coming out? It's more like, Hannah Reynolds, who's also a young adult and romance author, basically what she told me is she's published like multiple books as well. And she was like, with my first book, the roller coaster, the highs and lows were so high and low. It was like every day it was just like the other extreme. And as you get more books, there's still highs and lows, but they start to even out a little bit, at least emotionally. Like, who knows what's happening with your career? But it's like you said, usually if you're in the game long enough, something will have like happened before to you, or you're like, oh, I kind of like knew this would happen, or I'm more equipped to deal with this now. But when it's your first book, you really have to go through the process of like taking it all on. You're like, this is my only shot. Like, I'm being published. However this does, it's like how I am doing as a person. Everything is riding on this, blah, blah, blah. And it's just too much to put on authors, but publishing does put it on authors.
Yes.
I will put that on publishing. The reason that we feel that way is because they want us to feel that way.
Yeah, I mean,
Absolutely.
I completely agree with what Hannah Reynolds said. I think that it has never felt quite as over the top and dire as it did with my debut ever again, which is, I think, a really good thing, because I wouldn't wish that roller coaster on anybody. And I think most debuts I know would say similarly. The same way that it's funny, because like we all write YA, right? Like the same way that I feel like I'm writing these books about like teenagers having these really big emotions and these really big like firsts, and it all feeling so much more intense than it does for like a grown ass adult who's like already experienced something 4 or 5 times. I actually weirdly felt that way with the book. Everything, every email, every like potential like DM or like tag or interaction felt totally different than like now, where honestly I mostly just try to block out the external world. I'm very grateful for my readers. I am grateful for my career. And I also know that it's not good for me to engage too deeply with what happens to a book once it starts to go out in the world. My job is to write it and to do my best work on it behind the scenes. And I'm happy to talk about the things that I like about it and to post about it, but that's not actually my job. Hopefully readers like what I did, but like that's it. I'm out. I don't read reviews. I try really hard to stay out of it. I totally agree that weirdly, I was so eager to give my writing to publishing that I didn't actually realize it was taking too much. I'm going through a really big Mitski phase right now, and I feel like Mitski has a lot of music about like the industry taking more from her than she gave it, and her not realizing the kinds of like bargains that she had made. I really relate to that a lot creatively. I think that it takes a lot of determination and difficult emotional work to put your heart in your work and then know when and how to take it back out again so you still have it. The thing is, you can't disconnect so completely that you're writing stuff that you don't believe in or that you feel like you're just churning out, because then what's even the point? This job is so hard. You might as well make something you like.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's the inherent contradiction of it, is that, I mean, yeah, this is also my creative philosophy, that to write something that you think is good, you do really have to be very vulnerable. You have to be very emotionally vulnerable and really put yourself out there. And then it's like, publishing is like, okay, thanks for that. Now we're going to go like throw it to the sharks, basically. And also, if it tanks, we're going to blame you. That's essentially what happens. And it's a lot. And then you have to do it again when you write your next book. So you have to kind of develop amnesia about the fact that that's going to happen and be vulnerable again.
Just jump right back in the water. Well, you were talking about like getting into the pool, but it's like, now you know there's sharks in the pool.
Right.
Yeah, you know a lot more now.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's such a balance with like reviews. Like when I went on to Goodreads to pull a couple of reviews for the program I'm creating, it's the first time I've been on there in a very, very long time. And it's interesting, the more you sort of disconnect from the negative reviews, you have to sort of equally disconnect from the positive reviews, because they're about the reader. They're not about you. They're about what the reader brought to the story, because otherwise, how could they be so hugely different, all from the same source material? But at the same time, we don't want to become so blasé about what's happening that I think we also become so numb to the things that are worth celebrating, or we kind of put what's worth celebrating so far away and put it's only the big things. It's only the certain number of sales or the starred reviews or the seller lists and like all that kind of stuff, when we forget that we can celebrate. I actually got up and wrote this morning, or I had a little bit of dialogue that I thought was like really clever. We sort of forget that those things are allowed to also be kind of magical and fun, and part of the reason why we're even doing this in the first place.
Right. And those are the things that are in our control. I mean, kind of. It's kind of in my control whether or not I write good dialogue. I don't really
It's like
know
you
what
and the
to control
muse.
that. Yeah, me and the muse. I don't know who's behind that. But yeah, like those are things that we can control whether or not we tried to write good dialogue that day.
Just like even like showed up.
I think we should give just showing up more credit than
Yes.
we usually do.
Absolutely. And that's where I'm going to pause us for today. There is still so much incredible conversation left, but you'll have to wait until next week to hear it. Before you go, though, I want to direct your attention to a very important link that is down in the show notes. I recently joined forces with the amazing team over at infostack.io to bring you something really incredible. And if you're not familiar, InfoStack is the leading discount bundle deal site online. And no worries if you weren't familiar. I wasn't either until I was invited to join them and got to learn a little about them. So what they do is they hand curate these specific collections where they have lifetime access to premium tools and resources that are usually valued at thousands of dollars, and then they make the entire package available at a massively discounted price. And today, June 7th, they are rolling out their most exciting collection ever, which is their Write, Publish, Profit 5.0. And I'm so excited to announce that one of my programs, my Create Better Characters with Coaching, was chosen to be part of this really cool bundle. So when you purchase, in addition to getting lifetime access to my masterclass, you also get 30 plus other tools that will help you on your writing journey, whether that's trad or indie. There are e-courses on marketing your book, there's writing software subscriptions, there's courses on creating your author platform, and so much more. I couldn't possibly list it all, but if you click the link, you will get all of the details. Just make sure you do so before June 14th of 2022, because that is when the sale ends. So go check that out. Make sure you look at all the amazing things, and you're probably going to want to get it because it looks really freaking cool. I'll be back with you next week to give you the rest of my amazing conversation with Mara and Christine. Until then, check the link, go get that amazing bundle, and happy writing. If you enjoyed this podcast, then you've got to get on my email list. You'll get my best advice sent right to your inbox with concrete steps on how to stay in love with writing and banish burnout for good. Go to isabelsterling.com/join to sign up. When you do, you'll get one of my favorite worksheets, the 5 causes of writer's block. I teach you how to diagnose why you're stuck and how to get writing again. That's isabelsterling.com/join. See you next week.